Hey everyone, it's Marvin. If you think the US needs better representation for minorities, especially during this election season, then you should check out The Future of Our Former Democracy, the chart-topping history podcast from More Equitable Democracy and Larj Media. Each week on The Future of Our Former Democracy, hosts George Cheung and Colin Cole dive into what our democracy could look like if we left behind our current winner-take-all model and embraced a fairer, more proportional system. If you need somewhere to start on this podcast, I recommend listening to the first episode where George discusses how his identity as a queer Asian American fueled his activism and commitment to social justice. Follow The Future of Our Former Democracy wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today with an author chat with Teresa Wong about her new graphic memoir, All Our Ordinary Stories. As always, Books and Boba is supported in part by our listeners. So if you'd like to become a bigger part of our podcast, head on over to patreon.com/booksandboba, where you can become a member and gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as monthly bonus podcasts. And definitely check out our latest Boba chats where we celebrate our 8th anniversary as a book club.
Yeah, I love the fact that we got to read another graphic memoir about the Asian diaspora experience, this time from a Chinese Canadian author. And we had a great time talking to Teresa about her start as a writer and then her unexpected transition into graphic novel illustration and just into stories about her family and how they came to Calgary, which is where she is now based. And also we talk about mother tongues and generational differences and healing generational trauma. So there's a lot of heavy topics that we touched upon, but it was a very fun conversation.
Yeah, so please enjoy our conversation with Teresa Wong.
We are here with Teresa Wong, the author of the graphic memoir, All Our Ordinary Stories, and also Dear Scarlet. She is a teacher of memoir and comics at the Gotham's Writers Workshop, and her comics have appeared in The Believer, The New Yorker, McSweeney's, and The Walrus. Welcome to our show, Teresa.
Thanks for having me. I love your podcast.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you. It's always weird to hear authors say that they actually listen to us because you guys are a concept and we talk into a void.
Yeah. So we've started doing, I guess, icebreaker questions to kick off our author chats. And Rira has tasked me with this episode's icebreaker since I am on paper a Canadian like you.
But, on paper. Where are you from?
I was born in Toronto, but I moved to the States when I was 1. So barely, I'm like legally Canadian because I have never naturalized as an American. But culturally, I'm totally Southern
That's
California.
handy if you ever need to leave the States really fast.
Maybe,
right?
yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I was trying to think of like a Canadian themed question. But all I can think of is because you're based in Calgary. Have you ever been to Stampede? And if so, what's your favorite like snack bar?
Have I ever been to Stampede? I've been to Stampede almost every year for almost all my life. For those of you who don't know, the Calgary Stampede is our annual kind of fair and rodeo and exhibition that happens every July. And it's an institution in Calgary. I mean, not everyone agrees with it. I'm a little iffy on the rodeo part of things, and the whole cowboy culture. But it's a lot of fun, and you can't get away from it if you live in Calgary.
Yeah, I've actually been twice in my life. And
have
always
you?
been, my friends took me there, took me on the pub crawl, and it was early 20s
the whole
time. Yeah.
city kind of just shuts down for a week, and you can get free pancake breakfasts everywhere you go, like every local strip mall, every church, every car dealership. And so, yeah, my favorite food is actually not on the Stampede grounds. Like, they're known for, your fair food, like deep fried Oreos and things like that. My favorite food are the pancake breakfasts. And just the fact that for a whole week you could get, a free breakfast where, just out wherever you go out your door. Like
That sounds pretty awesome to me, though, like just walking around just getting free pancakes.
Yeah, you could probably hit 2 or 3 in one morning, every morning.
The one fair food that I saw at Stampede that I did not have the guts to try it was deep fried Coca-Cola.
I
don't know.
How do they
even know how to do that?
I think what they did was they infused Coca-Cola into the oil and then they just threw batter in it. That's how it looked like to me. I didn't have the fortitude to try. I wasn't drunk enough, but yeah.
So I always like to start our conversation with, were you always a writer? Were you always a reader? I mean, graphic novel is such like a niche genre or medium in literature. So I would like to hear, how did you get started as a graphic novelist?
Well, I was always a reader ever since I was a little kid, and I'm definitely a book person. And if you could just let me sit and read, I'd be happy for my whole life. And then I was very good in English class at school and stuff. And so I thought, I'd love to become a writer and kind of join the conversation of all these books I was reading. But then, typical child of immigrants, like I had to be practical too. It's like, I'm not just going to, be a writer. Like, I have to have a job. And so when I went into university, I took an English degree, an English lit degree, as well as a teaching degree so that I could teach English. And then what happened was I discovered, well, I knew this about myself, but I didn't really know it until after I'd graduated, gotten a job as a teacher, and learned that as an introvert, it's actually really hard to teach, like really draining and to be around, junior high kids all day and, be on, and then also go home and mark and, prepare for the next day. And I realized very quickly that this was not the career for me, and ended up seeing what I could do with my English degree and getting into communications, writing and copywriting and advertising. And so that's actually my day job. And then, I always had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a book, and particularly about my parents, because I thought their stories were really interesting. And in 2003, I took a trip with my parents to China and Hong Kong, which I detail in the book. And I came back and thought, okay, this is it. I need to write this. And I was a, really good corporate writer, but I didn't really know what I was doing as a creative writer. And I just kind of started writing, little pieces and vignettes, and then decided to sign up for a certificate of nonfiction writing through Humber College in Toronto. And this was in, I think, 2007, and still sort of early days in the internet. And so it was a correspondence course, like not online, because they didn't have online learning yet. And I just sent manuscript pages via snail mail to my mentor in that program, who happened to live in France at the time. She was a Canadian writer, but lived in France. And she would mark up the pages and mail back my manuscript to me. And for, I think it was about 8 or 9 months, I did that. And I had, at the end of that program, a 40,000 word manuscript that wasn't quite working. It was, it was kind of, there was good stuff in there, but the story there was, it felt kind of flawed in a fundamental way, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And then my mentor had advised just, putting it away for a little while and kind of letting it sit. And then after that, I had 3 kids in 5 years.
That'll keep you busy. Yeah.
Which totally blew up my life. And at the same time, I was starting to read all these great graphic novels, graphic memoirs. And when I was pregnant with my 3rd child, Isaac, I realized, maybe I have a different idea for a book that I could do, and that I'd like it to be a graphic. And so I started working on a book called Dear Scarlet, which was my first book about postpartum depression when I had my first child. And I thought for sure, because I was a writer, that I would just write the script and collaborate with a friend who was an illustrator. And this friend, what I did was I kind of cut up my script and pasted bits into a sketchbook and drew out what I thought it could look like, kind of in a really sketchy style. And I gave it to him. And then the next week we met for lunch, and he kind of pushed it back across the table at me and said, I'm not going to do this. And I'm like, what? And he said, this story is so personal and so vulnerable. It has to come from your own hand. If I do it, it's not going to really match your voice and tone. And he was like, you have to do it. And I said, well, I can only draw 25% better than what I've shown you here. I'm a writer, not an artist.
Illustrating is a totally different skill. Yeah.
I know, right? Yeah.
My question is how did you know that Dear Scarlet was better fit for a graphic medium rather than prose or poetry or any other medium?
I can't touch poetry. I don't feel qualified to write that. But as a graphic, I thought it would be good because, first of all, depression is a very quiet time for a person. If you've ever gone through it, you feel very isolated and kind of removed from everyone else. And then also being at home with a newborn baby, was a very quiet time for me. I didn't know how to talk to her. My husband had to go back to work, and it was just me and the baby, kind of in silence most of the time. And I felt that, to properly depict that silence, that I would need to show it in imagery. And so, I had this vision, and now I had this, mandate to make it myself. And so what I did was I Googled how to make a graphic novel. And I went, and one of the first hits was, there's a graphic novelist named Raina Telgemeier, and she writes middle grade kind of graphic novels, writes and draws. And she had put up a blog post, which I think was for children, actually, about her process, the kind of paper she bought and the kind of pencils she used. And, she went step by step. And I said, okay, I'm just going to copy this. So I went out, bought the same paper, bought the same type of pencils. Didn't have the same amount of skill level, obviously. But I made a thing. I drew out my book on paper and then scanned it and kind of hacked my way through it, figuring out how to put in text and panel borders and stuff like that. And then I had this manuscript, and I always thought at some point, after I had gotten an agent and gotten a publisher, that someone would, in the process, just stop me and say, whoa, why don't we get you a real illustrator? It's I like this story, but, we can make this better looking. And no one did. And so it just all happened. And the book came out in 2019. And then I was a graphic memoirist.
That's pretty amazing. I mean,
I know, yeah.
looking at your book, I wouldn't have imagine that you were like I guess you would call like a DIY graphic novelist, but learning on your, that's pretty cool. I mean, have you always been like, when did you start drawing? And I guess in the process of making your graphic memoir, like what did it take until you got to the point where it was like, okay, this is good enough for me to show somebody what I'm working on? Like, how did you develop your style?
I mean, my style is basically for both books, but the original book, the first one, the top limit of what I could do, right? And so it's a very, like, if you've seen it's a very sparse book. And people are like, oh, I love your sparse, style. And it's like, no, that's just because I couldn't draw anything else. But I drew as a kid. I knew I could draw a little bit, and I took art class, in junior high and high school. But then, realized very quickly that I didn't have the skills to become an artist, and so kind of left it behind. And then I didn't pick up drawing again until I had my kids, and it's just from sitting and playing with them. Little kids are always asking you to draw stuff with them or for them, and so I would do that. And I guess I must have felt like it was good enough to show people, because I did. I mean, we got the thing published.
It is like, it's not stick figures, so it's definitely better
it's like,
than
okay,
it
well,
could
this
be.
is the best that I could do. If you guys are okay with it, I guess I'm okay with it. And, that first book, sometimes I still, like, cringe at some of the pictures in it because, like, they aren't the best, and I've gotten better over time, But, it was the best I could do at the time. And I think I don't know, I think that's okay. Like, everything that you put out there is, if it's the best you can do at that time, then it's nothing to be ashamed of.
I mean, it's definitely okay if it got published. And I will say, reading your novel, I mean, the sparseness of, like, the simplicity of your illustrations mixed with the power of the prose and the story you're telling, it really does mesh together really well. So I think I would say it's very successful, especially this year it's published,
Yeah. No, I think, the beauty of comics is that there is no real bar. Like, it's not about, making a perfect representation of what you see in the world. And comics is kind of a big and wide tent. Like, there are comics that are literally just strict stick figures, but they do the job as well. And as long as you can communicate with your drawings, right, communicate a feeling, an idea, a story, then, people will pick up on that and appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's move on to your latest graphic novel, All Our Ordinary Stories, a multi-generational family odyssey. Can you give our listeners a brief synopsis of what your book is about?
Well, on the surface, it's a bit about my parents' stories. They both grew up in communist China and were both sent to communes when they were young people, kind of after graduating high school. And during the Cultural Revolution in China, and they saw, no way out besides to escape. And so they both traveled, many miles by train, bus, bike, to get to a coastal area in the province of Guangdong, where they could get close enough to the Hong Kong border to swim. And so they both attempted to swim across this bay to get into Hong Kong territory and basically leave China that way as refugees. And then, the other parts of the book are about my growing up as the child of immigrants and kind of how their, what they went through probably affected my life more than I understood back then. And then there's also bits about my great-grandfather who came to Canada in the early 1900s and faced a lot of struggles too, because at that time, the anti-Asian sentiment in this country was super high. And the country actually ended up passing an Exclusion Act for the Chinese in 1923, and it ended up separating him from his family in China for decades. Like he had two little kids in China, one of whom was my grandmother. And she basically grew up without her dad, got married, had my dad, and had no relationship with her father at all. And so it's kind of, it talks to kind of ideas around intergenerational trauma, but it's a little more nuanced than that. Like it's just about how past generations influence my life now and how I'd like to take the lessons learned from that and pass certain things on to my children as well.
Yeah, I mean, this memoir is a lot of things, as you just described. And it largely explores like the tapestry of your family's immigration history as well as Canadian history on like immigration policies. It's a lot of things that you had to explore. Did you ever feel daunted by the scope of the project?
I think at the very beginning I did, because I was like, how do I structure this thing? Because there's so many people involved and so many time periods in different countries. And I think once I landed on a structure, though, then it kind of felt doable. And so I don't know if the structure actually comes out very clearly to the reader.
I think the structure came out pretty well, actually.
Yeah, I kind of did it by the different kind of barriers that I saw in kind of between me and my parents. And the first set of stories is language barriers. And then the second set is kind of more like cultural barriers. And then the third set are historical barriers. And then the last are just kind of personality barriers. and I know it's always difficult. Like, I don't know what your relationship is like with your parents, but for me, I can never tell whether something is like cultural or if it's just my parents are weird, like.
I think that's very relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I did want to devote a section to that, because it's like, it could be also that they're just, really different from me and our personalities don't sync,
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's always a combination of both, right? Because, your book also explores this, like we all grew up under different circumstances, us as diaspora, children of immigrants grew up in a society that values independent thinking, kind of having dreams and being able to like at least conceive of being something other than what our situation is forcing us to be. Our parents and our grandparents' generations grew up in a time when like, if it wasn't war, it was something. There's always a crisis to
they were surviving. It was all about survival.
Yeah.
And for hundreds of years in China, it was like that.
And those stories are also hard to talk about, right? Like when you escape trauma, like you don't. These days, therapy is for us to explore that, but that's not as something that is, that's not. You touched on this in your book too, like modern healthcare. Even talking about problems is not something that the older generation is familiar or comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so how was it collecting these stories? Like, I imagine it was really hard to even get them to like sit down for like one session with you to like collect your research.
It was easier earlier on. So, like I said, I started this book like 20 years ago. And so my original interviews with my parents were pretty good because they were kind of younger and they were fresh off that trip to China. And so they kind of were happy to talk about it back then. And now that, they're 20 years older, like they're in their late 70s, it has changed, like, and after my mom's stroke too, like her whole outlook on life has changed. And so it is a lot touchier and more difficult. And I don't like, putting her through pain in having to remember all that stuff from her youth. And so I was really lucky because I recorded our interviews back in the early 2000s, and I had that kind of source material. And I also had, I guess, my original manuscript, which I read through before. I didn't consult it very often when I was writing this book, but I read through beforehand just to, make sure I wasn't missing anything like that I had forgotten.
That is a good point. I did feel like my parents were also much more open to like talking when they were like in their late adulthood, early elder years. Now that they're a little bit older, now they've become kind of like people I need to manage. And I think that's just part of getting older, right?
I think so.
That's really funny because it's the opposite with my parents.
Is it?
I they would not talk about like their childhoods unless they were like bragging about like what they suffered. And then later on, like as I got older, I think they were more open about sharing their experiences. And it's just I think it just depends on like your parents' personalities. Like
I think so. I've heard it both ways because some people, as they kind of near, the end of life, like they do want to tell you everything, right? Like
they're running out of time,
kind of time running down. Yeah. But then there are others who are just really stoic, and I've heard not just about Chinese people, but kind of this generalization too of maybe people who grew up in poverty or disadvantaged that they don't like to talk about the past. Like things are okay now. Why don't we just be happy?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a quote in your memoir that I thought was really striking. I see now that my parents aren't capable of giving me what I want, a deeper relationship, their whole hearts. I let them give me what they can, which usually means random food and stuff. I may not have gotten what I needed, but I can give my own kids more. And that is such a huge revelation. And I feel like most of us come to it really late in our journeys with our parents. It's so different and difficult to like navigate like what your relationship is with your parents as an adult. Like, when did you have this revelation, and how do you think like your kids and like this new generation of Asian diaspora is like gonna heal past traumas?
I think I came to the revelation when I was writing that. So I guess just a couple of years ago, I think the main thing is a friend of mine, actually a few years ago, who isn't Chinese, was talking about, Maslow's pyramid or Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And how, maybe they're just still stuck at the bottom of the pyramid, like the food, shelter, safety, right, are at the base of the pyramid. And that's all they wanted as kids and, young adults or, throughout their lives growing up. And maybe they weren't even aware that there was more above that, that there's more to the pyramid where you can actually kind of reach like a level of self-actualization. And so after that talk, I just kind of thought, like, I can't expect them to, know more than they know, right? Because if this is the level at which they operate, then, I can't blame them for that. Like, this is how they grew up. This is what they saw as a good life. And in that respect, they gave me a good life, right? I had a roof over my head. I had enough food to eat. I was always safe and secure. And so, I can't fault them for not giving me all that other stuff that they didn't even know about.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of another scene in your memoir where you try to share a moment with your mom by watching the Joy Luck Club together. And like she loses interest halfway through. And I thought this was such a relatable scene for me as well, because I've tried to like, okay, here is a story about Asian American, overcoming generational trauma. Let me share this with my parents. And they're like, this is not fun. Because my dad wants John Woo action movies. He wants his entertainment to be escapism. Like I think he like got up and left halfway through everything ever all at once because he thought it was dumb, right? And I was
that has a lot of action in it.
Yeah.
I know it does.
So I think definitely
yeah.
I think our parents just have a different view on like what being a good parent is, right? And
I think so. And also what good entertainment is.
Yeah. And also like they don't like, I feel like they do know what we're trying to tell them and they don't like the message. So they're just disengaged, right?
Yeah, do you honestly feel like they know that? Like, I really feel like my parents don't. Like, that they're like, oh, you need, to be, like, praised or comforted? What? Like, shouldn't just be happy you have a full rice bowl? Like,
yeah.
I'm, like, remembering a time when I was, like, younger and I would watch K-dramas with, like, my parents and, like, they would have, like, because it's soap opera, because it's K-drama, like, the parents and, like, the in-laws would be really over the top, dramatic, and, like, self-sabotaging in a way. And I'm like, and, like, my parents would be like, oh, like, I can't stand people like that. I can't stand people who, like, are so emotional. And I'm like, you're overly emotional and you don't know how to emotionally regulate. But, they just couldn't see the problem. They couldn't see the flaw in themselves. So yeah, maybe they just don't recognize it at all. It just goes over their heads.
That's the way I choose to see it anyways, because it's like, it helps me, kind of negotiate my feelings around that. And I really do believe like even if I don't get what I need from them, that doesn't mean I can't change and kind of shift the way the next generation is treated.
Yeah, it made me question like what is more challenging as an adult trying to communicate with their immigrant parents, like not having the fluency of their mother tongue or just like not having the emotional foundation to talk to them about very like emotional topics. Because I've seen I've seen other kids of immigrant parents who don't have like a full grasp on their language, but they're very close to their parents and they're able to like talk about like a lot of things. I'm like, I wonder like which one is like more challenging.
Yeah, I think personality is actually, my guess is more of the thing. Personality or values or your how you see the world, your perspective, and because you can go around language if you want to enough.
Yeah, I mean, I feel there are a lot of variables, right? There's personality, there's upbringing, there's also class and privilege and resources. Like, if you grow up having with both parents having to work all the time and you having to like, take care of your siblings or to like kind of be self-sufficient, there's going to be a gap forming that way as well, right? And that's something that, like, again, it's an ordinary story, but it's like when it's personal for you, it's like this is a foundational piece of like your being, right? Like this relationship and what it is and isn't.
Yeah, I agree. It really does also, just depend on the amount of time that your parents can give you. Like you said, my parents were working class, and so they didn't have a lot of time with us from a very young age, and they had a lot more other things to worry about, just paying the bills.
Yeah. It's going back to mother tongue, which is the first chapter of your memoir. And it's all about your relationship with, Cantonese. And, so I'm expecting my first children soon.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
That's something that my wife and I have. We're both Chinese, but we speak different dialects. And we're trying to just figure out how are we going to approach, like, the dream would be that our kids would grow up bilingual, be able to be fluent in both English and Chinese. But, like, neither of us are... Like we're fluent conversationally, but our vocabulary sucks. So like, how do we approach that? Like, I guess my question for you is like, can you talk about how exploring this in your memoir has affected how you view your relationship with your mother tongue and how you approach your kids' relationship to it?
I mean, I have a lot of regrets, but I also don't know how I would have done things differently. So I grew up But the first 4 years of my life were in Cantonese only because I was with my parents all the time. And then I went to school and learned English and kind of never looked back. And then I also kind of refused to go to Chinese school after a while because I wanted to watch Saturday morning cartoons. And my Cantonese is very rudimentary. I can kind of function, but barely, and mostly only speak Cantonese with my parents. And so I did not feel comfortable at all passing that on to my kids. Like, I just, all my mistakes and bad pronunciation. And I just, it didn't feel so clear that I could do that. And then my husband speaks Mandarin. And so we also felt like, how could we converse with each other if we tried to like speak only Chinese at home? And so I let my kids become unilingual. They're tweens and teens now. And I don't know if that was the right thing. I still don't know. Part of me understands that even if your first language is lousy and you teach them a bit, that might, open up neural pathways for them to be able to learn better later on, And so I don't know if I've kind of cut them off from that forever. I have a little hope because I have a friend who's white, and she learned Mandarin, at age 25 and moved to China and became very fluent. And so, I think you have to really want it. And I don't know if my kids will, but I think, eventually they're going to have to decide for themselves how much of their heritage they want to tap into through language.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've seen a lot of, like, especially Asian Americans of my generation, like, have their awakening in college, right? Once they, like,
Yeah, me too, right? Yeah. Right. I took Mandarin in college because that was what there was, because I wanted to learn Chinese finally.
And, like, I feel like the ones that learn Chinese through, like, formal schooling tend to, like, they speak better than I. Like, I have a couple cousins who have, like, white spouses who did learn Chinese, like, in their 20s, and they speak way better Chinese than I could ever hope to.
I hope it's not too late. My one daughter and I are right now learning Mandarin through Duolingo. Okay. Yeah. And I don't know if that's every little bit helps. Yeah.
I mean, as someone who like went to Korean school for like 10 years, let me just say it does not make a difference in the end. It's just, it's literally how much interest and how much effort you're going to put into the mother tongue.
Yeah, I feel like that that is the case from other people I've talked to too. But it's a big kind of gray area for me. I don't think there is one right solution.
Yeah. And reading that really did open up, like, got me thinking to, like, how, like, I think that's the power of your memoir is, like, as someone who, like, is in this situation or will be in this situation, like, just thinking about what I want to do too.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you this, though. Like, I am so glad that I can talk to my kids about anything, and that we do share a language, like, which is English. And so you'll always have that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
they'll always have your books as well.
Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of the bargain our parents also, like, made in raising us here. It's just like, if you wanted us to be Chinese or super Chinese, like,
Yeah, it is a big sacrifice on their part, I think, to have lost that. And actually, I haven't thought that much about it until right now, like whether my parents wish they could speak with me, and not the other way around.
Yeah.
I love the analogy of monarch butterflies taking multiple generations to complete their full migration. It is like to contextualize the Asian immigration experience. Like, you don't, like, every single generation has their own journey and you don't know where that journey ends up. Like, how did you come up with that? Like, when did you hear about, like, monarch
I can
butterflies?
tell you exactly where I heard that from. Actually, I was reading a book by a Canadian writer named Miriam Taves. called Women Talking. It became like an Oscar-nominated movie, I think, last year. Or anyways, and in the book, the book is about a Mennonite community, actually, these Mennonite women. And one character says to the other this fact that monarch butterflies, it's not the same butterfly that flies all the way up to Canada and back to Mexico. Like, it's actually several generations that complete the trip, and that stuck in my mind because I was like, oh, I didn't know that. Like, and it, I immediately began thinking of it in context of like kind of the many generations of my family that have, led up to me, like since my great grandfather coming to Canada in the early 1900s. And just thinking like, we're all making a step on the journey. I don't know if any of us has found our way home yet, and I'm guessing my kids are the ones who will actually be the ones who feel like settled and, complete. Like, but who knows, right?
It really is an apt metaphor for just the experience of diaspora, because I think us as the generation after the initial landing, right? Or in your case, well,
I'm both second generation and fourth somehow.
Right. We're kind of like a transitional generation, really. Like we're the much like you depict in your book, forever translating one culture to the other. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like we're still on the move, right?
Yeah.
Because of being that kind of bridge also, or bridging between two cultures, languages.
You said that your book, I mean, it took you like 20 years. And I'm curious, like, because some of your chapters in the book, it starts with the phrase, "this is a beginning" and not "the beginning." Do you remember what the first comic you created for this book?
Oh, yeah, it was definitely the first story.
Oh, it was the actual first story. Wow.
Yeah, I wrote this in order. I think, almost all. But my original book didn't have any of that, because I hadn't grown up, I hadn't had kids, my mom hadn't had a stroke yet, that kind of thing. But I kind of knew always from this iteration of the book that I would start with her stroke as kind of the beginning, because that's when I really started thinking deeply about our language barriers and and how messed up things felt within our family. But then, when I was thinking about that, it's like, well, really, maybe it began, when I got married and left home, right? and then it's like, well, no, really, maybe it began when they left home, when they left China, and then it's like, well, did it really begin then? Because they wouldn't have come to Canada if my great grandfather hadn't left his home, And so you can pick almost any beginning. Like a family's story goes all the way back, right? And all the way forward in a way, right? This is also not the end. Like, I know it doesn't end with me, even though I wrote a book about it and kind of finished it.
Yeah. Well, your novel is out September 24th. So yesterday, from the day we're recording this interview, you're probably hearing this interview in 2 weeks. So the book is out at booksellers everywhere. Definitely Go check it out. Are you working on anything else right now? Are you just focusing on getting publicizing this book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a lot of marketing and publicity for this book now. I did have a bit of a period between finishing this book and it coming out yesterday. That I really should have taken as a chance to start on something new. But honestly, I was so kind of wiped and drained from finishing the book and kind of going through, kind of reliving my whole life, basically, in writing these stories that that I took it as a downtime. And, now I have an idea for another book, but nothing really started. And I think I'd like to write a bit about kind of my journey to becoming an author and the unusual aspects of it, debuting later in life, like in my 40s, not living in a literary center like Toronto or New York, basically being a suburban mom and also being a woman of color, I think I read a New York Times thing in 2018 or 2019. It was like, I think 5% of books are written by Asian Americans, or and the publishing world is still like mostly white, and so just kind of navigating that and figuring that out too. And I feel like I have something to share with people who are like me, who want to get into this creative work.
Yeah, I think, it's really nice to hear that you have more nonfiction stories to share with the world. Do you have any hopes of, dabbling in fiction in the future?
I think about it sometimes. I'm very scared of it. I'm as scared of it as I am of writing poetry. And I love reading fiction and poetry, but it feels like something I can't do, but I guess, drawing was something I couldn't do 10 years ago either. So, never say never. I think just, I'm going to follow, where my instincts lead me.
Yeah, well, it's a great graphic memoir that really hit me in my Chinese American feels / Canadian, I guess, legally. So congratulations on the release. And yeah, thank you for joining us on Books and Boba.
Oh, thanks so much for having me and for this great conversation.
And that was Teresa Wong. Her latest graphic memoir, All Our Ordinary Stories, is available now at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. So head on over to booksandboba.com, click on our bookstore link. All purchases there support not only us at Books and Boba, but also your local bookstores. So definitely appreciate everyone's support. Before we call it an episode, Rira, can you remind us what we are reading this month for book club?
Yeah, so we are reading The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Cowell, and it is a novella that is a razor-sharp and bewitching fairy tale of discovering the darkness in the world and the darkness within oneself. It has a little bit of horror in it, so it fits our Spooktober requirement that we asked our Patreon members. So thank you so much for your suggestions, everyone who pitched in.
Yeah, so if you're reading along, please let us know your thoughts about the book, either on Goodreads or on our Discord server if you are a Patreon supporter. We always love to include your thoughts on our discussion podcast whenever possible, especially for this month's spooky read. But with that, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you once again to Teresa Wong for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey Brian, did you go to Saturday school as a kid?
I sure did. Did you?
Totally.
Well, at our podcast, Saturday School, we don't teach a language, but we pass along the culture that we do know.
And that's Asian American pop culture.
Ada's a journalist, and I'm a professor and film festival programmer.
We've watched a lot of great Asian American movies, and we want you to watch them too. Come listen to us as we look back at the pioneering films that have led us to today.